Okay, welcome back. Last session of track 1, and we have Gunter with us. And Gunter is an amazingly cool person who's done a lot of really neat things, but he made the choice to put on his bio that he is, due to his ability to see dead people, he developed how many dead people do you see? Do you see them right now?
Not right now.
Okay, all right. That he's developed an interest in first century archaeology. So we're just going to do a small quiz.
Pre-medieval.
Oh, pre-medieval. Okay.
Yes.
All right. So what's your favorite ancient South American civilization?
So I never did that. I did like European
Okay.
and focused on UK.
Oh, so we can talk about Moche pottery some other time.
Yeah.
What was the byproduct of Hallstatt, which is currently useful to the world?
I have no idea.
It's uranium. Oh, man. Anyway, Gunter's going to give you a talk on security, and it's going to be awesome because he's an awesome person, and I'm going to go over there. By the way, one more thing. You are going to get evals after this conference. They come from BlueHat, and they come from the BlueHat address. They're legit, and I will remind you at the end of this talk as well. Fill them out because they help us. They help the cab pick the stuff for next year. They help us know whether or not you liked us, that sort of thing. So, Gunter on security.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So I get like the graveyard shift, right? So everyone's like itching to get out. So I'll try to wake up a few folks here. So raise your hand if you're a software engineer. Okay. Raise your hand if you're a hardware engineer. Okay, let's give me a minute. Raise your hand if you know, have ever tinkered around with silicon engineering before. Oh, there are a few. That's cool. That's cool. Don't ask me any questions later. That's fine. Let's see, are we going? Yep. So I want to look at, and sort of really open to the folks here, really sort of discover and talk about really where the next phase, or the hardest phase of hacking really lies today, in particular, the extraction of secrets. So I'm going to walk you really through what the state of the art is in extracting secrets from silicon, and really give you an insight into what you can do from a hacker's perspective, but also from a defense perspective. But to really sort of work through that part, and really need to sort of explain what we're trying to do. So where do we start this sort of thing? Really, what I'm interested about is really protecting secrets. So, what are we trying to protect? Normally, we're trying to protect secrets and intellectual property, so code for encoding, decoding systems, cryptographic routines, patent pending technologies, magic numbers, crypto keys, all these sorts of things. And why are we trying to protect it? We're often, we're trying to preserve the time to market, before someone can reverse engineer our secret source. We want to, maintain control or influence a market segment, for example, for hardware consumables, financial compensation, such as, I want to protect streaming media, or, given my past life in the pen testing side and things, smoke and mirrors, all these, here's something very, very cool. It's ultra secret and doesn't actually do anything. Right. So what about the history of reverse engineering? I think everyone here over the last 2 days and continue for the next couple of days really understands the reverse engineering. So a lot of the work that's has traditionally been focused on software reverse engineering. Right. We took those secrets, the things that we cared about, and we put them inside code. But if you're familiar with code, and decompilers and debuggers, you can start extracting that code. So we start looking at obfuscation techniques, anti-debugger techniques, just-in-time decryption techniques. All these sort of things happened in the software side. And every time we invented a new way of keeping a secret, someone figured out a way of bypassing that. So we moved a lot of those core secrets away from the software and started putting them into the firmware. Okay, so we'll move those secrets to the firmware. We'll raise the barrier for entry. Okay, now to be able to extract these secrets, you have to have familiarity with the hardware. You need to have a little bit of a hardware hacking tool set and a mindset. Okay. But there are other techniques around that, such as eventually the firmware needs to be updated. So perhaps if I crack the firmware updates, I can get a better understanding of what's sort of going on there. Which sort of leads us to where we are much today is that, frankly, if I want to keep a secret, the last place and the hardest place to go to today is the move to silicon. Okay. has an advantage. That is, there's a high barrier to entry, right? To really get down to that silicon level, you have to know what you're doing, but you also have to have access to a specialized set of tools. But also some unique disadvantages. Once you're locked into that delivery at the silicon level, you can't really reverse this stuff, right? You can't make sort of rapid changes. And sometimes if you're actually etching onto the silicon to store those unique secrets, if someone can reach that level that deep into the silicon, they will extract those secrets. And if you sort of think of past failures of trying to secure secrets in hardware, such as the magic numbers to DVD regional locking or Blu-ray locking and things like that. Once they're finally leaked, that's the game over, right? Earlier today, there were a couple of sessions really focusing a little bit on the hardware hacking side, right? So, let's say that I have access to the motherboards, or the PCB, and I can start, introducing, probes, and I can start attaching to all the connectors there, the smart card connector, the serial connector, the JTAG, the USB. Add my probes there and start messing around with power voltages and glitching and things like this, and try to extract those extract data and information from the systems there. I have a broad tool bag, software tools, oscilloscopes, logic analyzers, probes and sniffers and things like that. And that's a lot of the hardware hacking. It's cool fun. If you haven't done it before, come over to I think Building 27, into the garage, and sometimes we'll do some sort of exercises on the hardware hacking. It's great fun. It's nice to be doing the hardware hacking because here you can actually use your eyes, and your fingers and start getting messy into the hardware. But the area that I want to focus on is the layer below that. Really is net is at the ICs, so the integrated circuits. And what's really happening in this space is that to understand the security of IC engineering today is really the cost of defending your chip, your IC, is proportional to the level of defense. What that means is that the more money I spend trying to secure my chip, the more secure technically it should be. The problem, though, is that for many of the chips that I want to secure, that chip may have a retail value of, say, 2 cents, right? So how much effort do I put into trying to secure this particular type of chip and type of technology? So there is a balancing act to be had for many of the most secure silicon-based technologies. Okay, so let's meet the IC. My favorite chip, the Intel 8008 chip. I like it two ways. In one way, it is the founding chip that's modern PC-based CPUs are based upon. The other thing is that it's as old as me, 1971. Okay, just sort of think about this. So 45 or 46 years old. A little over 3,000 transistors running at 0.5 megahertz, and the fabrication technique at 10 micrometers fabrication. Here's another view of that same sort of chip, but now sort of overlaying the power rails, the data rails, and things like this. Okay, so here we can sort of see that it's an 8-bit arithmetic logic unit and 14-pin addresses. And you can see nice little color diagram of where the data layers are, the data lines are. And so if I wanted to sort of hack this chip, I'd be interested in really tapping where those data layers are and watching data as it flows. Now, another way of looking at these views, if you like, is really at the block diagram of the user manual, and give me a sort of an overall layout of where memory segments are and things like this. That's great, but where are we today? So today here is a slice of cutting-edge technology. So here is the Samsung Galaxy S8 chip. You'll notice that in this size, that the smallest piece on this chip is now down to 10 nanometers. So in 46 years, we've shrunk by 1,000 in size. Okay. Another important thing to understand is that while 10 nanometers is pretty damn small, most of the chip is not, while we hear about chips being fabricated at 10 nanometers, 40 nanometers, and things like this, there's the smallest part of the fabrication. That's normally the transistor. Okay. The other layers of the chip, though, and I'll talk about those as we go through, are normally much bigger than that. Okay. And in case you're sort of wondering here, what was sort of shown in that top diagram, if you sort of think, if you've come from any sort of electronics or physics background, sort of think back to, I don't know, grade 8, grade 10 sort of thing. The first time you hear about N gates and P gates and sort of things like that. That's on the right-hand side here. I think there might be a laser on here. No, maybe not. Where you see the gate cap, that is effectively, on the smaller diagram here, the base. Okay, so to give you a sort of a feel for what you're looking at through the slice of the chip there, you're looking at the individual transistors there for a gate. Okay. So what about on the reversing side? What are some of the interesting things? So how did reverse engineering used to be done? Well, when we had nice big chips, with plenty of circuits and things like that, we could use a microscope, and because the tracks were, in micrometer scale, I could use the visible light spectrum to understand and to read these things from microscopes. It also meant that I could print these things out in a visible spectrum, and this is how reverse engineering was done. You print it all out, and you would track with a pen on paper and scraping these sort of things out. We have moved on a little, but to sort of get a better feel for this, I think I got started in this, and a lot of people got started into the IC reverse engineering. Really, in many ways, I sort of blame MAME. Anyone here familiar with MAME? Cool. Okay. So one of the key things for those who aren't familiar with MAME is it's really a global group of people that want to restore and recover the old games of the first generation of video games and things like this. So for example here, the background image, this big green blob here, is the IC, and in fact this is a part of the IC. So this is the mask ROM for the 1992 Sega Virtua Racing processor, right? So all that code, that game code and all that, is actually stored in this masked ROM. And if you sort of squint a little bit at this masked ROM, there's a couple of things you can see. So first of all, you see like these big rectangles. You can sort of see like 3.5 big rectangles running down the screen. Okay, each one of these rectangles has 16 rows, or 16 columns on this side. Okay, so so here we have a 16-bit processor. And if you squint a little bit, you'll sort of see like these blobs in some of the tracks. Those are actually your ones and zeros. Okay, so by taking this processor, trimming it down and getting down to that microscope view, you can actually read the bits on the chip that are behind the code. Okay, and I think this sort of like starts much of the role of when we start talking about how you want to protect your greatest secrets and things like that. The fact that you can, at this level, visibly read the code and all the secrets off the chip, should start getting your mind wandering a little bit. Now, IC reverse engineering is cool fun. Come on, there's a lot of things there. Techniques haven't really changed for the last 20 years and stuff like that. But name another part of information security where you get to play with literal laser beams. Fuming nitric acids, electric probes, microscopes, electron microscopes, everything like this, right? And literally roll up your sleeves and dive into scraping away layers of chips and things like this. So there's a lot of things that are that form this methodology, such as many of the hardware hacking techniques that we're familiar with, at least that we could see in manually and by hand control access to data trails, data tracks, and extract data. And more techniques really focused on breaching the actual chip itself. So an interesting thing about the state of the art in IC reverse engineering, especially the high security chips, is that it really is an adventure in hacker defense dynamics. Right. So, for example, I'll talk through some of the methodologies for breaking chips and extracting data. But so one of the techniques that you may use is to use acids to etch away layers of the chip. Okay, so that works for some ways. And so if I want to be an IC designer and stop people from doing that, well, maybe I will use reactive materials in my chip such that when the acid touches that, the chip catches on fire or disintegrates and things like this. What if I use an X-ray to examine the chip and things like that? Well, maybe I'll dope the silicon in such a reflector such that X-ray can no longer work in this. Okay, I'll add photosensitive fuses so that if you're trying to observe this and do the delayering, that the fuses will blow because of the infrared light or something like that. And maybe I want to protect secrets, so I'll put active meshes over the top of my, my masked ROM, for example, to stop you from reading the actual data and stuff. So lots and lots and lots, and some very cool innovation on there. And so, a little bit like Raiders of the Lost Ark, you're trying to bypass one protection technique and overcome that one, and as soon as you trip that layer, there's another layer on top of this, and so there's a lot of learning that sort of goes on. But at the end of the day, there is a very simple methodology for really reverse engineering a semiconductor. And this part, when I talk about the reverse engineering, is really to understand the microprocessor, the IC or the chip. Okay, and so there are 5 key pieces to this. So decapsulation, delayering, imaging, image analysis, and then the data extraction. So this is meant to be an eyesore. I'm not going to run through it, but effectively, the decapsulation part is really how do I, when I have a chip and that the chip isn't exposed to the elements, it is encased in something, okay, and depending on what the chip is going to be used for, where it's going to be hosted, the environmental conditions, they'll have different types of encapsulation around this particular chip, and will require different types of techniques to release or to access the actual chip itself. So one of the easiest ways, and for most of these sort of things, so most of many of the chips will use a plastic or an epoxy covering, in which case just dropping a few drops of acid, in this case fuming nitric acid, will expose the chip as well, right? And depending on what sort of connectors, so in this particular chip here, there are gold connectors from the chip to the pins. The fuming nitric acid doesn't dissolve those, and so you can sort of see the chip in all its glory. Other ways, decapsulation through milling, so not quite your dad's or your mother's drill press and just moving the chip around, much finer. So effectively removing the covering of the chip, whether it's an epoxy or maybe a ceramic or something like that, exposing as much of the chip as possible, being very careful, and then maybe using acids afterwards, for example. Other ways, using lasers to gradually etch away the particular chip and removing a few micrometers of the chip through every pass of the laser, for example, to expose. Another way, if you want to do it sort of the more professional way, is here is a professional decapsulation device, and effectively there's a little clamp that goes up and down. You hold the chip upside down, dip it in there, and it sprays the acids and different mixes of acids to etch away the chip in the most efficient manner. Having exposed the chip, you give it a little bit of a cleanup, so spray cleaning, or use different types of acids, or ultrasonic cleaning, or another heating elements to remove any other particulates and try to get it as clean as possible. So, but what do I want to delayer a chip, especially at that first stage? So, so stepping through, a standard sort of chip here, we have the Apple A4 microprocessor for the iPhones. Now, if I was to look at the back of the chip, I'm not going to really get much intelligence at the back of the chip on this side. By using an X-ray, I get a slightly better feel for this chip. Not really, okay. Now if I scrape away the layers into the very top layer of metal, so metal 8 here, I start to see what the actual chip looks like. That's cool. That gets me to that first layer. But now I have to be really careful. If I'm going to go through the whole process of delayering this chip, I need to know how many layers there are, how the thickness of the layers are, and sort of work through there. And so what I'll try to do often will take a horizontal slice through the chip and start measuring where all the different metal layers are and where all the different silicon layers are and things like this, and insulators. So in the delayering process, I've got a couple of pictures here into taking this particular slice. So the one on the left here, you'll see this particular chip has 5 metal layers. And you take some measurements against this particular chip here, and so that as I'm working through extracting or sanding down or removing one layer of metal after the next, I know roughly where the right layers are. The other chip here, though, is interesting in that so there's a newer generation of chips which make it a little more challenging, and that's we're seeing 3D fabrication. So here is actually 3 chips that are, the equivalent of 3 microprocessors stacked on top of each other, connected together inside a single chip, okay, which makes it much more complicated to analyze later on. Now, the art of delayering really is an art, right? So taking a particular chip, it's very time-consuming, very delicate work. It's one of the hardest parts of the whole process and really understanding reverse engineering for ICs. And so you're having to remove layers of the thin conductor and the dielectric films and things like this. What you'll normally try to do is that the purpose of going through this delayering is to basically build some images. And so you'll have multiple versions of the chip, multiple copies of the chip, and as you go through one layer, you present that. You may, some of the layers may be reactive to the atmosphere, and so you may lay, a splatter coating of gold or some other sort of film over it to stop it from reacting, and so you can take images. And then you set aside that one, you start on the second chip and go down to the next level, et cetera, right? Some chips, can have some of the more common chips today for microprocessors will have 11 to 13 layers that you need to go through to get this size. So having gone through that whole process of delayering the chip, so we've decapped, we've tied it up, we've delayered it, and we should have some some photogenic pieces there. Really, we need to lay our eyes on the secrets here. So there are a number of tools that we need to look at and to use, and it really depends on the fabrication process and the sizes of the chips and the sizes of the rails and the size of the fabrication process. So using a good microscope, I can get about 500 to 1500 times zoom. A fib or a focused ion beam. So if you're not familiar with this, so the focused ion beam is basically firing large ions, which means that I can get a magnification somewhere between 250 and 800,000 times. I have to be careful, though, with a focused ion beam is that because I am firing quite large particles, I can use it for examining, and for taking photographs or whatever. If I leave my beam on a particular part of a chip, it will actually etch a hole through it. Or if I use a fib with other gases, I can actually lay new layers of metals, on the actual chip itself, and that's helpful for, for overcoming light-sensitive diodes or meshes and things like that. So I can bridge just like laying new wires down. And the last but not least here is the SIMS, so the scanning electron microscope. It gives me a magnification up to 1 million times today. So I have a decapped, and a nice metal layer of the chip, for example. So one of the techniques I'll use will be front-side analysis or front-side analysis imaging. So effectively here I'm taking that layer of metal, I'm putting inside a scanning electron microscope, and I am building up a whole bundle of different images. So I can't take a photograph of the entire chip all simultaneously, and so this is actually one of the most painful, time-consuming processes. Really is, take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photographs of this chip and then restitch them all back together and hopefully get it right each time. Okay. Another way I can use is backside analysis. So if I take that sort of chip, and still often in a powered state, if I now look from the other side of the chip, I'm seeing much more closer to where the transistors are and this actual poly layer. I can use things such as near-infrared scanning microscopes and near-infrared lasers because silicon is transparent to near-infrared. Okay, so I can start to see from the other side of the particular chip. It gives me a better idea of what the layout of the chip is and things, of what's sort of going on there. It's getting more difficult because as these technologies and these tools for being able to take these types of images become cheaper and more common, then the fabrication plants are now doping the silicon to make sure that near-infrared doesn't really work, right? In which case we change frequencies and use different frequencies, and still a game of cat and mouse, in protecting the device. So having had this image, and this compiled, one image of one middle layer of, hundreds and hundreds of, hundreds by hundreds of images, I get, an image per layer of this chip. So using, in this case, I think it was Photoshop here, here are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, at least 7 layers of this chip sort of overlaid here, and then taking those images, then tracing out where particular data lines are, and trying to think of, identify the vias, so where I go, where a connection exists between one layer to the next layer of the actual chip itself. Right? And start mapping out where all the critical junctions are, where the critical logic blocks are, where the security elements of the chips themselves are. Newer inventions, though, are exciting in that maybe in the next 5 years, that entire process of delayering and things like that, and that cumbersome process of imaging disappears due to 3D X-ray microscopes. So it's a newer technique today, currently have a visibility of reconstructing elements at the 17 nanometer scale. So effectively, this is builds up this 3D model of the chip as it was built in one go, which will simplify a lot of things. Another area, again, sort of on the cutting edge, is that while I showed you that one for the virtual racer and looking at the mastered ROM being able to read visually, and that's cool. But if you like, the state of the art in protecting your on-chip memory is really to use. Screen's gone. To use flash memory in particular, and that's been very troublesome for reverse engineering. Now, well, over the last decades, scanning capacitance microscopy, SCM has been used, and it was good for pretty much most memory types. But now the latest generation of scanning microwave impedance microscopy allows you to actually view an image flash on the chip itself. Okay, a nice thing about this as well is that the chip can actually be powered and active. And so what you sort of see on these particular images here, and on the left-hand image there is almost like a heat map of where the electrons are being stored. But on the right-hand side for the flash memory here, you can actually read the ones and zeros directly from the chip while it's powered up, and you can watch it in real time if you wanted to. Okay. Other things that you can do and already understand that is that, so while you may store code and magic numbers in the ROM on the particular chips and things like that, often you'll have optimized code routines. So for example, calculation of hash functions and things like this, you will store in logic arrays on the chips themselves. So there are a number of tools. So for example, there's an older tool, but DGate, which is designed for mapping out where all of the logic gates are and automatically bringing those pieces together to be able to understand the higher level logic. So here we start seeing the individual flip-flops and the XOR functions and things like this actually on the chip at this sort of level. Right? So it comes in very handy for being able to understand, even at this visual level here, being able to work out where the important parts of the chips are that I want to break into, or to read directly the actual microcodes or stored code on the chip itself. Right. So if I've got that sort of plan, I now understand what the chip looks like, I understand where the data is, and I understand many of the functions and features on there. What about when I actually want to get the real data off? Okay, so I need to go through that entire process and really start drawing out a plan for data extraction. Okay, so what I need to be doing here is I need to be figuring out, where are those data lines, where are the power lines, where are the cryptographic routines and things like this, and figuring out, even from the visual side, where can I lay new wires or cut wires or lay new tracks or destroy tracks or, overcome some of the physical barriers to get, to the core data that it wants. So for example, let's say I have one part of the chip is storing, my data, but encrypted formats on the flash. So while I could read the encrypted data and as an encrypted blob, it's no use to me. However, I know that there is a cryptographic routine that's on the chip itself there, and I see the data goes from the flash to the cryptographic routine and then out through this particular other data lanes. In which case, then I want to start tapping where those data lanes are, and then I will see the data after it actually has been automatically been decrypted on the chip. Okay. Now, there are a lot of different things that's sort of going on here, and one of the nice things that fib, the ability to, if I leave it too long in the wrong place, it'll etch a hole through things. I will use that for my use, right? So for example, here at the middle screen here, we have a mesh, very, very, very fine mesh that's been laid over the chip itself, an active mesh, which means that if I was to remove the mesh to get access to the layers below there, the chip will stop working. Well, I don't need access to the entire chip. I just need access to certain data rails, right? And so in which case, in this case, I'll use my fib to create a hole precisely where I want it so I can put my probes down and actually get to the right layers within the chip. Other nice things are with using something like a fib is that I don't just have to go straight down. I can go at an angle and I can actually curve my holes that I'm trying to dig through the chip itself as well. So I can lay that down. So once I've got my interesting points that I want to tap onto the chip, and maybe I've constructed a number of holes through the different protections techniques on the chip, then I'll use microprobing. Right. So earlier today there was a session sort of really talking about the hardware hacking and the probing side. Same principles going on here, except we're now operating at below the visible light spectrum. Right. And so the microprobing here is really where I want to be able to selectively put my probes very, very fine, at the maybe 50 to 100 nanometer size probe to touch the right parts of the chip. Right. And so for example, here what we see is the probe station in operation with 8 probes touching the data lines, and the work that sort of goes in there. Interesting things about this is that when you are operating at that nanometer scale and you're putting in these probes, as sort of found out in the past and things like that, you don't want to have your building anywhere close to a railway station or a highway or an airport or things like that. You're going to have floating tables, air tables. You're doing everything to sort of remove the bumps out and all this. However, if you're unlucky that, I don't know, the UPS truck drives past your office or whatever, and you had your probes down, then all of a sudden maybe you've lost 8 probe needles, and at $1,000 each needle, you've broken them all, right? And so with the probes down there, obviously you're touching various parts of the chip, in particular, the data lanes, and you can watch the actual data as it flows through there, extract the actual data, and you can use all of your hardware hacking techniques on resetting data lanes, power lanes, and things like that, which then leads to things such as the glitching approaches to extract the data that you're after, assuming that you couldn't read directly or manipulate the code that was on the chip in the first place. Okay. So glitching, a systematic approach to forcing, for example, changes in power values or durations of power or voltages to force the chip or force functions within the chip, depending on where you're tapping it, to elicit new behaviors or to recycle behaviors. So on the extract and secret side, ideally from a hacker's perspective, you're going to be looking for where the memory areas are, the ROM, the EEPROM, and things like that. And so while many of the ROMs may be masked, and it's still, unfortunately today, even when they say we have secured our ROMs, XOR seems to be the encryption choice for the XOR is the encryption choice of, I guess, people who don't understand what encryption is about. But certainly from the chip sides, it's rare that many of the chips will actually go much further than that in trying to protect the ROM data on there. Okay. But again, even using visual techniques, the bit pattern is often discernible just through visual or chemical imagery. Okay. Other advances that sort of, become very, very interesting and haven't really been around for, have only really been around for the last 5 years and are growing at a faster pace, really is the use of simulation software. So if I can take all my images, these huge, huge images and all that, and I can start overlaying, where the key parts of the chips are, and I can learn where my flip-flops are and start labeling these things, we're now getting to the stage that you can actually use simulation software. Okay, and so where these are more machine intelligence based and machine learning based for processing the images, identifying where all the data rails are, all the memory segments are there, and basically creating a vectorized virtual version of the chip. Once you have that virtualized version of the chip, then the whole sort of problem with having to dig holes physically through chips and lay needles down and all that disappear. Okay. So this is where, if you like, the state of the art is today, although it's still got a long way to come before you can really start simulating some of the system on chip type processes that are out there, because they're just too advanced today. It's also very, very time consuming to get into that vectorized image for simulation. So when I get to that level, why do I really care about those sort of secrets and things like that? So one thing that we need to be worried about, especially on the Microsoft side, are simple things such as counterfeiting, right? So if you're here, we have an example of, these chips look basically the same, and what's happened here is that this is a very, very cheap chip, and effectively what happened here is that and somewhere in the supply chain, someone had a chip that was lesser powered, less interesting, but they gave it the same sort of number and things like that. And the counterfeit part of this was that using the same sort of number, the part number and all that, was that it only really came to the fore that these were counterfeit chips when a vendor that was using these chips in their products updated their firmware to make use of additional processors and additional memory on the chip. And so the cheaper chip, the counterfeit chip, didn't have enough memory, and of course, people were getting strange errors and firmware errors and things like this. And so it's only through that firmware update that the counterfeiting side was uncovered because products stopped working. But even something that small, so why would anyone bother counterfeiting a 5 cent or 25 cents processor? Well, lots of reasons, really, especially if there's hundreds of millions of these chips being sold. I don't have to pay licensing costs. I don't have to go through the process or the costs of creating specially signed drivers for my chips there. I don't need to do any advertising, marketing expenses, and I can reuse my old dies and things like this. Okay. And so, from our perspective, being very careful of, what that means to our supply chain, and it's often very hard to debug as well, right? This is physical, it's rolled out, and you're trying to, solve this software failure through software means when, the failure is actually the hardware. Other things that's sort of going on in the market, so product teardowns. You may have seen a lot of these sort of things. So here is the current teardown for the iPhone 8 Plus. So Tech Insights and other other organizations, their process is grab the latest technology, strip it all the way down, work out what the cost comparisons are and things like this. So here we see the system on chip IC for the Apple iPhone 8 Plus, and you can sort of break out where the different CPUs are, the memory segments and things like this, and then do deeper dive on the actual part numbers inside those chips. And so if you really wanted to, you could refabricate this particular technology. There are other ones that go even further. So I see teardowns here. If you're familiar with the Microsoft HoloLens and all that, so here is a Chinese site, eWise Tech, which will sell you all the images, all the reverse engineering, the templates, the code, and everything that's been extracted from the Microsoft HoloLens CPU, for example, right? And for a small amount of money, you can then start, if you really were in that space, reusing those secrets or fabricating a new chip or a competitor chip to this. How much does it cost for if you like the pen tester, non-evil hacker, grey hats or whatever to extract secrets and things like this. So here is a Russian-based service that will do all the things that I explained to you about decapping, delayering, extraction of microcodes, all those bits and pieces down here. So if you like, that's one of the cool things of reading that protected code, those super secrets that are on the masked ROM and things like that, including all of the decryption and and everything like that. So 10,000 euros for that chip, whichever one you want to sort of do, right? Other ones here, so for example, here's a Chinese-based company that does the same sort of reverse engineering, but you can also say, here's a chip I'm interested in, they'll do the reverse engineering, and then they will make additional copies of that chip for you. Or if you want to, let's say it has a magic number on there and you would like a same sort of chip of a different magic number, or you would like, a chip will have lots of exactly the same magic number, maybe or maybe change a routine from change the random number generator into a generator of pi, for example. Sure, do that, right? So if I get to that level now, so the microcode, what do I have to really sort of care about? So what's possible today? Okay, so things that we ran through. So I can read bits at the metal layer, i.e. the mask ROM. Okay, I can read bits at the silicon level, so the storage memory. I can read the gate arrays to evaluate the etched algorithms, those patent pending technologies and things like that are there, right? And I'm getting up to the stage where I can virtualize the simulation of the chip functions itself. Okay. So by using probing techniques, then I can also extract those secrets, those particular stored secrets, the memory dumps and things like this. And I can also bypass any of the physical mechanisms that are used to secure the secrets on those particular chips. What also opens up, and if you like the cutting edge now really is I can do this through non-destructive. Okay, so previously, doing all the delayering and decapping. In fact, if you haven't done decapping, do it. It's great fun. It really is. But some of the newer technologies will actually do the non-destructive side, and so I can actually analyze the chips while they're in situ. Okay. Another key part about this is that while I do all the hard work for a particular processor and go through all the particular steps and things like that, once I've done that, right, I only need to do that once. And so thereafter, whenever I encounter that particular chip, I automatically know where I need to go, where on the chip, and where all the secrets are, and the fastest way of breaking these things. So, for example, about 5 or 6 years ago, Krasnodolsky broke the most secure TPM chips. And while it took several months to break the first TPM chip, and all that, having broken that first TPM chip, it was only then about 15 minutes to grab a new TPM chip of that same manufacturer and extract that core secret. Okay. So the imaging is just really a means to ends, and I think this will change quite a bit sort of going forwards as we sort of look at today a lot of the skill still lies in the human beings, and so we're still focused on, like that first image, laying out that big picture, scrolling around, drawing all the data lines and things like that. But with machine learning approaches that are being applied, especially in academia, there are already a number of, quite advanced software that will get that vectorization of the photographs to bring them all together, stitch them back together, and allow for that simulation side. Question that sort of comes back in many ways: what about attacks against mass-produced devices? What do we need to worry about, and what should we sort of care about from a security perspective? So, here's an interesting example worked on a few years ago with the team. Was let's say I have a genuine brand name toner cartridge and go to a laser printer. I don't know how many of you know this, but that toner cartridge that you have that goes into the printer actually has its own microprocessor built into the toner cartridge. And so when that gets into the printer, there is an exchange of secrets, and that with that exchange of the secrets, the printer then knows this is a genuine toner cartridge, and therefore you should use it. And if it's not a genuine toner cartridge, then obviously it's not genuine, and you should not use it. So if you are not from XXX company and all that, there's an awful lot of money for cheap toner cartridges, right? And so what you want to do is maybe sell refurbished toner cartridges and things like this. So to be able to do that, you need to have your own chip with the magic numbers and things like this. And so, like when I started the conversation about how to protect, make chips secure, it's been about how much effort do I make to how much effort do I do to add to the security. It really is proportional to how much effort it takes for someone to reverse it. And so, for much of the design of the chips that go into, say, toner cartridges and things like this, ideally, what they're looking for is, as long as I get 1 year or 2 years before someone can reverse engineer my chip, and extract the data and then mass market it, that's probably enough for me to make this whole endeavor profitable. Okay. From the defensive side, and these sort of things, what do we need to look at? We need to look at, well, we want to use device-specific keys, okay, and we want to be able to update and revoke them at any time. So, the whole sort of thing about having static keys that are etched into the silicon and dynamically kept there, not such a cool idea, because we've talked about how we can extract those things, and so you need to be able to manage that per device. Ideally, use good crypto. Don't use XOR, right? Software encrypted algorithms stored in memory that erase the chip's memory. Okay, so what I'm really talking about here is that as I find in this particular example, someone else is now offering up toner cartridges that work on my particular printers, and that I would be able to change my algorithms actually on the printers themselves and revoke the keys that may have been broken the first time, for example, right? So I want to get the mix of both my hardware security and my software security and bring them together. Okay, and if I wanted to add optical sensors that erase the chip's memory as well. Right. So other things that have sort of been encountered, and so in the world of professional reverse engineering of ICs, there are a number of things that that sort of get uncovered, right? And so one of the biggest scary things, in particular, when it comes to supply chain, and given what we're trying to achieve on on the cloud security side and things like that, our supply chain needs to be pretty pristine. We have to be careful, and we have to look at new ways of securing these chips against attack, extraction of secrets, but also changes to the supply chain. So, for example, things that have sort of been uncovered before were extracting the core code and core functionality of a particular target chip, then modifying that code and embedding it onto an FPGA, and then putting that FPGA back onto the new board. And what that meant was that you have a modification of code, you've got extra keys, for example, that have been added to the extra magic numbers, replacing the random number generator, for example, or changing or deprecating the crypto functions, turning your triple DES down to DES or something like that. The hard part, though, is that the reality is hunting for backdoor on chips is really, 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 really hard. And it's really down to a handful of people that are so have several decades of reverse engineering the chips themselves and come from that from the semiconductor background. It's really down to those folks being good at spotting these needles in the haystacks today. But hopefully, with the virtualization of the chips, that will lead to new insights and new technologies in that space. So, what about defending the chips from reverse engineering? Okay, so the attackers themselves are going to often be probing and exploiting component interfaces. So from our side, we need to design with the assumption that the interfaces and the intermediate data will always be insecure and exposed. Okay, so if you are having an encrypted data blob and there's a crypto or decrypto engine and it's being passed through at some rail on the chip itself, then the bad guys will be able to tap into that particular data, right? Design uniformity is useful for obfuscation. So, if I can visually look at a chip and say, that's the memory area, that's the process area, this is the power area, this is everything else like that, it speeds up the attacker's side. However, if I visually design the layouts with more uniformity, it's much more difficult. Also, electrical uniformity. So when we talk about things such as, if the layout all looks very similar, and I want to find whether, I'm interested in the memory or the crypto algorithms, I just run the chip, and then use a thermal imaging, and while I'm doing a lot of crypto, then the area that's the process on the the area on the chip that starts getting the hottest is probably going to be where the crypto algorithms are actually running, right? And the coldest part of the chips are going to be the memory is, right? Resistive grids seem to be very popular with smart cards, security chips. Frankly, they're pretty much meaningless from an attacker's perspective. They're limited use against probing, but once you've gone through the reverse engineering process, there's sort of not much value there. So sort of walkaways from this really is that it's not sufficient to secure software components from software attacks and hardware components from hardware attacks. Basically, as you're designing the chips and designing the use of the chips and the software that goes with them, they have to be designed together in such that you're protecting the chip with software and hardware, and you're protecting the hardware with software and hardware. So the threat going forward today, really the barrier for entry is still pretty high. You can get started with your own equipment in your own lab for about $500,000, or you can go out and just rent by the hour. $300, $200 seems to be fairly good rate today if you know what you're doing, or like some of the firms that I made mention of around the world, which will actually do it for you, do it on your behalf. Other key things though is that that IC codes is immobile, right? So once that code is cracked, you are not in a very good position, right? So as you're looking at how you're going to keep secrets sort of going forward, and that's really understanding that once that code that was on the chip has been broken, that there really is no viable means of restoring that integrity there. So as I wrap up, last part, sort of hat tips from my side. Chris Donalski and Joe Gran are two folks that have worked with and great respect to that, just really understand and do this so much of their time. And a few additional resources if you're interested in sort of having a look at some of the images, playing around, getting a bit of familiarity of what's sort of going on in this particular space. I'll leave those sort of around there. It's great to sort of great to learn from these types of sites. So with that, pending the last session there, open to questions. Yeah.
Okay, questions, and I am my own microphone runner this time, so. That was a cool talk. Do you have questions about why he has such weird hobbies?
We'll do like a photo display of what happens if you put your fingers in fuming nitric acid. No. Don't do that. So a question right at the back and then one right at the front and back and forth. Yeah.
Hello, thanks for the nice talk. I didn't see a mention of optical emission analysis, such as measuring photons while chips are being used. There's been some research that allowed for identifying AES keys by these techniques, but I didn't see any mention in your slides. Is there any reason for that?
Short of me trying to cram an hour and a half into 50 minutes, really. There's a lot of techniques that focus on the magnetic wavelength and photonic discovery techniques. Well, at least, sorry, some of the electromagnetic discovery on those. I tried to grab some of the ones that I think are some of the ones that are probably changing the world a little bit more, so like the 3D X-ray type systems there, and techniques that are more focused on the flash memory observation, reading memory. So.
Yep. Okay, thanks. Makes sense.
More questions?
Any more questions back there? Hey, this is cool. This is an easy one. So everyone feels like those super cool secrets that they have to keep secure for the next decade. All good now? Okay.
So this sounds like you might have a little bit of personal experience. What have been some of your war stories that you've really enjoyed? Gotchas that you hit and went, oh, I should have seen that coming. Can you share any? I mean, I assume you're not going to be talking too much about secure compartment of information type of projects, but what's been fun? What's been interesting from your specific experience?
Well, I mean, from the fun side is like how I sort of started on this, and that in the information security world, you're used to bits and bytes and all that. The fact that you have all these tools and things that you can actually read the bits themselves, and all the mechanisms that you use to actually get down to that level, It is like a childhood dream, playing around with acids and laser beams and all this sort of stuff, right? Doing cool stuff. But from other things that have been exciting, really, is really working with many of the some of the chip fabricators themselves, right? So they're so focused on how do I take this technology and create the best, most efficient chip for the cheapest amount of money. And then you sort of go in there and you pop their balloon of those things that you thought were really cool and really nice mechanisms to protect the chip in that price bracket really were meaningless from this side. And the response will be, well, that's cheating, and then working with them of what some of the other mechanisms are. But the unfortunate part about much of this really is that because you are operating at that physical layer, frankly, the best, the most secure part of this entire industry is making the chips even smaller and smaller and smaller, because the technology that's required to make the chips that's much smaller is the same technology that's required to reverse engineer the chip. Right, and so if I move from a $500,000 scanning electron microscope, and now I need to spend $20 million on an equivalent to get down to the 10 nanometer and manipulation, all of a sudden that barrier has gone up again, and that's the best way of protecting today. And so in many ways, securing silicon is about staying on that edge of the technology, the most expensive edge, because it forces the bad guys to also run parallel on that expensive edge, unfortunately.
Oh. Okay, Ray's coming.
Would you say that there are any specific attacks or, on the other hand, countermeasures that are specific to smart card chips, or are they about the same as for other chips, generic ones?
No, I mean, so the smart card chips, have a particular purpose, right? So their functionality is very focused, and they're not particularly versatile. So there's a lot more effort that goes into securing the particular chip, and much of the work has been on the securing the physical elements of the particular chip, right? So there's a higher barrier to reverse engineering the chip, and that's where a lot of the reliance goes on, right? If it's going to take an expert in this field 6 months to be able to reverse engineer the chip to be able to get down to the levels and things like that, then I know that chip is going to be secure for 6 months, and maybe if I find out who those people are and I engage them on another contract that's going to take them a year, then I get 18 months runway before the particular chip comes through. But there is a lot of innovation going on the design of the chip, right? We talked about a little bit about the active meshes that go on there, the things that you can do with the actual fabrication of the chip, understanding the methods that the reverse engineers are using to break down the chip, and adding other physical means and chemical means seems to be where the battle faces today. But at the end of the day, once you have got iterated through all the physical pieces, then the underlying data is what's being exposed. Right? But also from smart card side, it depends on what you're trying to do. In many cases, a smart card there is a reprogrammable magic number, right? That's sort of laying at the heart there. If the only way that I can extract that magic number is by getting physical access to that chip, and extract from that particular chip, then the attack surface is rather limited, but also the end value. The end value is really that smart card chip is then only a piece to how I'd get access to the actual data that I wanted, because the data isn't on that chip itself. Right. Cool. Question at the back there.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Do you think there's more increasing interest in sort of the peripheral devices more so than the actual main devices themselves? Like the premium devices you mentioned where you need to protect IP seems to be pretty well protected and you're raising the barriers there, but what about the peripheral devices or wireless devices? Do you see more interest happening in there in terms of research for reverse engineering and for development?
So there is an awful lot going on in that space, and that's probably the most active space, because the reverse engineering that's going on there is less about trying to steal the secrets. It's trying to steal the codes for basically counterfeit versions of those products, right? So let's say that I have a special type of webcam that's used for smart city traffic monitoring, right? It has proprietary code in there. It's got a lot of AI type, machine learning type code in there and that sort of stuff. And then, someone else can, physically buy that device, reverse engineer, extract that code, and then strap it onto their own device and start selling it in competitive space. So I think that there's an awful lot going on in that space, more from, counterfeiting the actual end technology, and where the IC is really just the holding of that secret or the microcode that they want to replicate. The other side, though, is that a lot of those smaller devices, or in that sort of space, aren't using cutting-edge, semiconductor technologies, right? A lot of the stuff is off the rack, and meaning that it's much easier to reverse engineer. And in many ways, many of the most popular chips that people use have already been reverse engineered at some point. And so the cost for the attacker is no longer, 2 weeks in a lab trying to reverse engineer the chip and to extract the code. Is now, $20, $100 to grab a chip reader that someone else has refabricated for that particular class of chip. Any last questions before everyone gets to escape?
Question.
Oh, here we go.
Hey, Gunter, this was a really entertaining talk. We had Indiana Jones and lasers and all kinds of other stuff.
Sharks and lasers, come on.
Yeah, I'm curious if you have an opinion on the use of inefficient design as a way to subvert this reversing process. Something like inefficient physical design of these chips would also impact the virtual mapping, as well as things like the X-ray technology, adding much more time to the process.
Yeah, so that has been a technique that's been used in the past, effectively like laying down lots of extra chip space that's not connected to anything, right? And so you end up with a lot of different data lines. You try to go up between metal layers, move three-dimensionally through the chip for your actual connecting wires and things like that, and then lay lots of false tracks and things. But they consume time for many of the visual techniques. But there are other techniques that then go through. So, for example, like the electromagnetic side and things like that. So once the chip's powered, the things that aren't connected or don't have any power through are not, are colder, and things like that. And so there are ways of vetting these things out. But to your point, adding these things increases the complexity for the bad guy, the reverse engineer. But it's probably, in many ways, it's harder for you to include that in your fabrication process than it is to reverse engineer it out today. Cool. Any last question for the road before everyone? It must be beers and things like that next, right?
That's actually the administrative announcement that comes next.
There we go.
So, round of applause for Gunter.
Yes, thank you.